Good morning, good afternoon, and in my case, good evening from Australia. But people have been joining us from right around the world for our Asia Society 2022 forecast event. It's co-hosted today by Asia Society New York, our global headquarters, together with Asia Society India and Asia Society Japan. My name's Kevin Rudd. I'm the President and Global CEO of the Asia Society, currently joining you from Australia. Normally I'm in New York. Hopefully I'll be back in New York as the middle of March when we're planning to reopen our building, Omicron and the pandemic permitting. We have something of an annual tradition here in the Asia Society, which is to, around about the end of January, early February, look at the year ahead, and based on what we best know about our different areas of expertise within the institution, to cast ahead and to give some indication as to what we think the major trend lines will be, major events to the extent that we can be predictive of them, and the implications for the wider region as well. So there are no hard and fast rules here. But it's worthwhile, particularly those dealing with markets and those dealing with the vagaries of country risk and geopolitical risk, to have a sense of where we think things may land by year's end. When we've done this event in the past, Tom Nagorski, our previous vice president, often used to refer to a quote from Churchill. And his quote from Churchill was, "A politician needs the ability to foretell what is going to happen tomorrow and next week, next month, and next year, and then afterwards to have the ability to explain why it didn't happen." So we shall bear that in mind in 12 months' time when someone holds us to account for the bold and brassy predictions that we're going to make among us today. But to help us in these deliberations, we're joined by three fantastic contributors. Firstly, Takako Hikotani, who joins us from Asia Society in Japan. Recently joined the Policy Institute as a fellow attached to our Tokyo Center. She's a professor at the Gakushuin University International Center, adjunct senior research scholar at Columbia, where she obtained her PhD. Previously taught at the Japanese National Defense Academy and the Ground and Air Defence Staff Colleges and the National Institute for Defence Studies. An expert on civil military relations, Japanese domestic politics and its foreign policy. And her most recent books include Trump's Gift to Japan, Time for Tokyo to Invest in the Liberal Order. Great to have Takako with us. We're also joined by Mohan, one of India's foremost foreign policy thinkers, foreign affairs columnist for the Indian Express, and a visiting research professor at the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore, previously affiliated with Carnegie in India, and a member of India's National Security Advisory Board. One of his most recent books was Modi's World, Expanding India's Sphere of Influence from 2015. And our third contributor is our very own Danny Russel. Danny, based in New York, is formerly Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia, a career American diplomat. He's also served in the National Security Council in the Obama administration, Senior Director for Asian Affairs in the Council. And prior to that was also US Consul General in Osaka and Kobe. He's our Vice President for International Security and Diplomacy at the Asia Society Policy Institute. And me, well, my bag of tricks is basically China, and I'll throw my hat into the ring to make some prognostications about China when we get to it. But let's open it up. I'm going to go to Danny Russel first, because Danny's familiar with our format, and ask Danny to give us 4 or 5 minutes as an opening blast on where he thinks the administration will be going on the big Asia relationships for the year ahead, starting with China, but ranges broadly as you wish, Danny, including on the troublesome folks who occupy the northern half of the Korean Peninsula. Over to you, Danny.
Thank you very much, Kevin. It's a pleasure to join this group. So I'll give you a bold and definitive scholarly answer to your question, which is it depends. So it depends on Russia and Ukraine, for example, because America's power to deter an invasion or to expel Russia after what happened is going to color what kind of year 2022 is going to be. And I think another giant variable, of course, is COVID, since we all know that Omicron's not the last letter of the Greek alphabet. It's going to influence the shape of 2022. I mean, I think to look ahead a year, we should first look back a year, and at least through the lens of the start of the Biden administration, recognize just the profound and daunting domestic and international landscape that the administration began. And I happen to think that Biden and the administration made considerable headway in 2021 against tough odds. But that said, the geopolitical, geoeconomic picture, the domestic political and economic picture with the looming congressional midterms, 2022, when you add that together, presents a pretty scary picture, frankly. I would also say that 2021 for the Biden Indo-Pacific strategy was a year of promise, or more accurately, a year of promises. And so 2022 is either going to be the year of delivery on some of those promises or of disappointment. And the ones I'd highlight would be, first and foremost, the domestic renewal agenda, legislation, the economy, social unity. That's been the first order of business for the Biden administration. There are, secondly, a package of multilateral initiatives like the Quad, which got off to a roaring start, Build Back Better World, which has been very slow to materialize, and then the still mysterious Indo-Pacific Economic Framework that I think nobody really knows what it is or what it's going to be. And so 2022 really hinges for Biden on delivering results in these three broad areas, beginning obviously, importantly, with holding on to his very slender legislative majorities in the House, in the Senate. Now, the third big promise by the Biden administration was to design a China strategy, and a China strategy that was going to, square the circle of competition and of cooperation. And what we saw in 2021 was the best you could say about it was that it was a mixed picture. You had a food fight in Anchorage, you had the meeting of old friends in the November virtual summit, and you had absolutely everything in between. But whether it's fair or not on China's strategy, there's a widespread view that the administration has yet to articulate a coherent and an integrated China strategy that ties together trade and values and technology and security and dealing with global challenges and with regional challenges. So I think 2022 in US Asia policy really hinges in large part, not so much on the 20th Party Congress per se, barring a real surprise. I think we can foresee that as yet another turn of the crank in a process of tightening political control in China, and not even so much which button Kim Jong-un presses in his effort to strengthen his position for when ultimately there are negotiations, and for him to define the topic of the negotiations as the withdrawal of US forces from the Korean Peninsula rather than the withdrawal of North Korea's nuclear capability. But really, it's going to hinge on whether the US can develop and can execute a China strategy, which is to say a combination of domestic and foreign policies that focuses on the areas that really need to be protected, need to be contested, but does it in a way that doesn't make it easy for Chinese leaders to push back, either in terms of the attitudes of Chinese people or of third countries around the world.
Thanks very much, Danny. The great Omicron and Ukraine conditionalities are very wise to insert those as it depends. Can I push you just for one extra minute on North Korea? You've handled this file yourself and your period both in the White House and the State Department. If you're a betting man, where do you think the DPRK will end up by year's end? Is there going to be anything dramatic? Or to tease out what you were saying before, is this one long protracted negotiating session with Kim Jong-un and prospectively the Americans, if you could ever get the Americans around the table? So a thought further from you on North Korea.
Well, Kevin, my experience is that the North Koreans really only have two speeds. And one is accelerating provocation, challenges, the demonstration effect. The other is the sort of faux olive branch, the suggestion that they are open to compromise, open to negotiations, and they toggle back and forth between those. The inhibiting factor for Kim Jong-un has been COVID. The North Korean, certainly the public health system is so incredibly fragile that Kim Jong-un can't afford to open the borders and to take the risk of a major outbreak, which they could not control. He also can't afford, for political and ideological reasons, an infusion of international assistance and aid workers to provide vaccines and so on. So he's in a tough spot. Ironically, COVID has undercut the self-reliance strategy of his grandfather that he's tried to emulate and forced him to become extremely dependent and therefore extremely vulnerable to the Chinese. Now, January of 2022 has been fairly extraordinary in the tempo of missile launches that he has conducted. It has some echoes of 2017, but I think there are some profound differences because although Kim Jong-un may be playing a little bit fast and loose on the run-up to the Winter Beijing Olympics by creating this disturbance that can't be what Kim Jong-un wants, he's going to be mindful of where the Chinese limits are, and I think that will inhibit his ability to launch a full-out sort of fire and fury challenge. But no, I think that what we're going to see is part of the very protracted game in which Kim Jong-un seeks to incentivize the Americans to come to him with compromises to rent a certain degree of peace and quiet in exchange for movement, or at least the possibility of movement to reduce the U.S. military footprint in South Korea. Kim Jong-un also is paying a lot of attention to South Korean politics. And I think he's setting the stage for him to begin pressuring a new South Korean administration after the upcoming March elections from what he sees as a position of strength.
Good, thank you for that. Roger Mohan, India, Mother India, for the year ahead. Your reflections, and given your recent assignment in Southeast Asia, Roger, any reflections you've got on major trends within that part of our wider continent as well? Over to you, my friend.
Thank you. I think let me make three sets of points. I think one on the domestic side, Prime Minister Modi is right in the middle of his second 5-year term. And he's in full flow. I mean, I think the sense that with an opposition in disarray, although he might lose some seats in this biggest state, so-called Uttar Pradesh, that's going for elections shortly. Think of it as California plus Texas. size, where he's had a huge majority in that state. He might lose some seats, but expectation is he'll come back, and that will give him a big boost for the 2024 elections. On the economic front, I mean, we had the annual budget just yesterday, and the sense, look, India is going to do 9% growth rate in the coming financial year and about 8.5 the following year. So for the first time in the last 7 years of his rule, where we had a series of economic setbacks and then the COVID, a sense that finally Indian economy is regaining its lost momentum over the last decade, that is coming back. So there is a huge sense of optimism, subject, of course, to the vagaries of Omicron and other possibilities. So the sense that, look, India is going to be back in a major way. It's already hit $3.1 trillion this year. It's likely to hit $8 trillion by the end of this decade. So I think the optimism is beginning to return on India's economic trajectory. That brings me to the second set, I mean, linking the economics to trade as you know, Kevin, I mean, I think India has not been the most friendly trade negotiator. Last year...
That's the understatement of the decade, my friend.
So last year, remember, 2019, we walked out of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership after years of engaging them. But I think that attitude, I think the politics of it is now fairly clear that what Modi believes is that, look, what China was undermining India's manufacturing sector, massive trade deficits, although the trade is going up, and an RCEP would further give additional access to China to India's domestic economy. So for the strategic decision, India will not be part of a China-dominated Asian economic order. I mean, I think there is no hesitation on this. There is a clarity on this. And much of the economic policies has been about building India's domestic manufacturing capacities across the board. I mean, some people will call it protectionism, but it's not very different from what China and probably the United States are doing. But that is a set policy, and that I think whole series of incentives. I mean, if I might put it this, for the first time, there is an open invitation for the Indian capitalist class. Look, this is the time for Indian private sector to really chip in. They'll have a free hand to run this. So I think this is a huge internal evolution of uninhibited support for domestic capital, as well as a strong invitation to the foreign capital to come and participate in India's new liberalized environment. So I think the expectation is this will further boost growth and strengthen it. On the trade front, having abandoned Asia in that sense, there is a surprising attempt to engage the West. Australia, if what they say is right, the expectation we'll have an early agreement with Australia on some kind of a trade liberalization agreement, whether an early harvest and then the big one, hopefully before the Australian elections. Then the most hopeful one after that is the United Kingdom. That again, free trade talks have started. There again, the expectation is before the end of the year, there'll be some agreement. And then with the United Arab Emirates, with Israel, with the European Union. So India is negotiating trade agreements. I mean, you can keep your fingers crossed until we see the first agreement. But this is a distinct change in India's policy towards actual attempt at negotiating free trade agreements. And there, the political principle, look, we have complementary interests with the Western economies. While with China, it was a competitive environment. With much of Asia, it was the same situation. With the West, we now have an opening and we're going to negotiate complementary trade deals. So it's not going to be easy with European Union. But my sense is we're beginning to see a reorientation of India's trade policy this year. And this year will be quite crucial to see if that actually succeeds. So the competition with China, I mean, whether it is the determination to do on the chip production, do a lot of things we import from China, from electronics, to a range of pharmaceutical intermediaries. So the focus is on building India's domestic capabilities. And India bets that for all the criticism of its protectionism, there will be a recognition that an India that is capable internally would be a better partner for the US and its allies over the longer term. In terms of India's geopolitics, I would say the China situation is bad and there is no give on the Indian side. The Chinese are saying, yeah, we have a territorial problem. We had a clash. Let's keep that aside. We'll keep talking about it, but let's get on with the rest of it. India is saying, no, you got to fix, you got to return to the status quo ante. Until you do that, the normalization of relationship is not possible. There, out of the 6 odd friction points we've had, 3 of them we've had some disengagement. Other 3 are being negotiated. But we haven't done the de-escalation. We have 50,000 odd troops. Both sides are fully mobilized, eyeball to eyeball. So we need to disengage and then de-escalate. We've not reached the de-escalation stage. But I think this is a slow, painful process that will go on, but unlikely to have any political improvement till the border issue is sorted out. And there is a sense that this China has actually forced us to resolve India's dilemmas, foreign policy dilemmas. The hesitation about engaging the US is gone with the Quad, with other countries. And more that China pushes India, the stronger will be India's resolve to work with the West and its Western partners to balance China. So I think the Chinese have left no room for any finessing of the China question. In that sense, there is much greater clarity, but on its own terms, of course, how India will relate to the West. But I think today, extraordinary positive attitude to doing more security cooperation with the Quad, with a range of other institutions. And more broadly, I would say with the West as a whole, and not just with the United States. And within the region, I would say the other problems like India had with Pakistan and all really pale into insignificance given the China issue that we have. My sense is, in that sense, a stronger domestic position for Modi, an improving economy, and a stronger partnership with the West, I think will propel India into a much greater balancing position in Asia in the years ahead.
Interesting, Raja, that Afghanistan has not featured in your remarks. Any reflections on Afghanistan and therefore Pakistan, China, and any further and additional strategic dilemmas for Delhi? Or is it relatively small against the grand strategic dilemma, which is China? Back to you.
I think we've had issues with Afghanistan since the time Alexander the Great showed up there. So any number of guys have come and gone. So this idea, I see often people saying, oh, US policies, there's no credibility after Afghanistan. I think that's a bit of an exaggeration. It's really Taliban is having deep trouble, and some of the troubles it's giving to Pakistan. And Taliban is showing that they not a patsy in the Pakistan army's hands. They're quite different. And Taliban is reaching out to India as well. So we have problems with the politics, but I think geography and they claim and their desire for autonomy from Pakistan will always give India some room to work with them. We've already sent them a lot of medical aid. We promised them to deliver food aid if Pakistan permits over land. Iran is open to doing things. So I think the structural situation where Afghanistan is a neighbor's neighbor, it will always do business with us. In fact, the problem is for Pakistan, which has to deal with a difficult neighbor and an open border that is actually ethnic border, which is open. So I think India is not in a way afraid of the situation in Afghanistan. Well, the US has left. I think it's good to make sure that we get a local balance of power and not determined by some outside power. I think Iran, Russia, China, everyone will have a role. India will not have the primary role, but will have a sufficient role to shape the outcomes in Afghanistan.
One final supplementary on trade. I was fascinated by what you said before. Is there a possibility of an FTA with the United States? And furthermore, more broadly, it would seem like a walk on the wild side, but given your remarks before about the high policy decision in Delhi about not having any association with a trading structure or architecture which has got China at the middle of it, what about India crossing the Rubicon and thinking about the Trans-Pacific Partnership or the TPP-11, which of course is minus China? Back to you, Raja.
Yeah, I think the question of what India does with the US. I mean, US is not in a mood to negotiate free trade agreements, so there is not much going on there. But recently we had the trade representative come to India. What they're doing now with the US, because we tried to negotiate a limited deal with the Trump administration, that didn't work. But now what seems to be happening is to really begin to give each other some access. Recently there was a deal on fruits versus pork. So I think the sense that, look, we can do small things with the US rather than negotiate a formal agreement. That seems to be the strategy. So my sense is if things improve over a period of time, yes, we can look at investment treaty as well as free trade agreement, but not right now. US is not the priority. Or if we can get some trade, give and take, go in the next 2-3 years, hopefully we'll be in a better position down the road. I've not seen any debate on CPTPP, whether those countries are interested in India or if India is interested in them. So at this point, I think India's focus would be to get this complementary agreements, bilateral ones, with the Anglosphere, if you will, with the West, with Europe, with other partners in the region. And then if you're strong enough, and then begin to see how we can relate back to the Asian structures. Because India's trade is rising. I think this year we will see India's highest ever exports, which is going to hit $400 billion. And if you include India's total trade, including services, it's $1.3 trillion. So walking out of RCEP has not really, in the near term at least, has not damaged India. And as more it creates a domestic capabilities, trade too will rise, I think.
Fascinating, Roger. Thank you so much. Takako, Japan, third largest economy in the world. And we are fascinated by what your thoughts will be on where Japanese politics will take us in the year ahead. How will the economy perform? And on security policy, and within that, the Japanese military, how growth is unfolding in terms of the Japanese military budget. And if I could probe you on one other thing, some of the more forward-leaning statements by Taro Aso and others on the question of Taiwan. But the floor is yours to take it in whichever direction you choose. That's just a few prompts. Over to you, Takako.
Thank you so much. This is a great honor for me to join such a distinguished panel. And I've been very nervous, but I'm going to try by concentrating on 3 points about what I see to be important for in the 2022. And I think there's 3 things to watch. 1 is domestic politics, 1 is diplomatic efforts, and 3 is defense. And I say this because, as Danny mentioned, 2021 was a year of a lot of promise for Japan, especially with regards to the alliance. And I think it's time for Japan to figure out a way to deliver on its promises with the drafting of a new security strategy and whatnot. But first, domestic politics. We had a very long lasting prime minister in Prime Minister Abe, which was not necessarily the case for the years before him. And he won, he had a very stable base domestically. He won 6 elections in a row. But he had to step down and had Prime Minister Suga step in. But now we have Prime Minister Kishida, who won a very contentious election in last year in October, and also won a lower house election in October last year as well. But for him to be actually an effective prime minister, as Mr. Abe was, he needs to overcome the challenge of the upper house election, which is to come up in July. And I think once he passes the test of the upper house election, he would be able to set forth with what he would like to set as his agenda, as the Kishida agenda for Japan going forward. And we'll be able to see how different he might be. We're starting to see what he might want to do, which might be slightly different from Prime Minister Abe, and whether he can deliver. And that will be up to not just whether LDP wins, but how he wins, if he's going to have enough support from the LDP to do what he would like to do. And I say this because Mr. Kishida comes from a little bit more of a less hawkish faction of the LDP, and that whether he can deliver the policies, although it will be basically continuation of the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy promoted by Prime Minister Abe. After all, he was the longest serving foreign minister under Prime Minister Abe. Still, he might want to make his marks on certain things that might be different from Prime Minister Abe. So that's the election timetable in July. And I think until then, he's going to be doing pretty much safe driving. And since COVID control is very important for Japan, unfortunately for all my friends who are waiting outside of Japan to enter, and for myself who would like to travel outside of Japan, I think Japan's border is going to be very strictly controlled for the time being for that reason, since the public seems to want a strict border control. And so that's the first thing is domestic politics in July being the election date. Two, although I mentioned July as the middle point, I think if you look at the diplomatic calendar, there's an interesting first half of 2022 and the second half of 2022. On the first half of 2022, we're going to be starting with the Quad Foreign Ministers meeting in Australia in February, and the Japan, US, and Korea Foreign Ministers meeting in February in Hawaii. And I think this has a lot more significance than we had expected because we've been just gifted with 7 missile shots from North Korea. So I think this trilateral meeting is going to be a lot more important than we without those happening. But I think the biggest one, which might be related to Prime Minister Kishida's fortune in his election, is the upcoming Quad Summit meeting in May, which is supposed to be including President Biden to come. And I think for that reason, too, Japan would want to very much make sure that COVID is under control so that it would be not an online event, but an in-person event. And so that will be in the middle. And then there will be the G7 Foreign Ministers meeting and the summit both in Germany. And this, I think, for Japan is important and Kishida's important because next year, 2022-3, it will be hosted by Japan. And Prime Minister Kishida would like to have it hosted in where he's from, which is Hiroshima. So I think there will be a lot of effort to make sure that that might be able to happen. But still, as I said, whether he can continue will be contingent upon whether he can win in a way that he would like in the upper house election in July. So that's the diplomacy part. And 3, in terms of defense, Japan's, I can say that it's almost overdue for Japan to come up with a new security strategy, which has not changed since 2013. And it's somewhat ironic because Japan's was very proud of being the one who promoted the free and open Indo-Pacific, which was adopted by many countries around the region. And yet there's no mention of the free and open Indo-Pacific in Japan's own national security strategy. So I think it is good that it is about time that we reflect the changes that took place since 2013, which was very important for Japan in thinking about the strategic environment. So what are the changes since 2013? I don't think I need to really repeat to you or the audience, but Japan is in a much tougher situation geopolitically with a much more assertive and confident China, and possibly the US that might be less committed. And we don't know about that, but I think there is an awareness that there might be some resource constraints in the United States due to what's happening domestically and possible prioritization of the domestic economic agenda within the US. So that is one. And the second is that Japan has been working on different arrangements with different countries around the region since 2013, including the most recent reciprocal access agreement with the Australians. So in some ways, there has been a lot more that's been happening on the diplomatic front, and also on defense agreements in a unilateral sense since 2013, which is not reflected in our national security strategy. So 1 is the language on China, but 2, on the efforts that we've done that needs to be included in the national security strategy. And 3, of course, is how we will be building our own defenses to be more, to deliver on what we promised last year and also what we've been promising in the 2+2 discussions with the United States, which most recent one that took place in January. So in order for that to happen, I think it's important that we do review, and it is going to be a year-long process. And I think it's gone off to a very good start, that it seems like the drafting of the process will be very pragmatic, and that it's going to be, there'll be the national security strategy and the national defense program outline, and the midterm defense plans, all 3 of them going to be drafted. And it will be reflectant of what we're going to see in the new national strategy, security strategy that's coming from the US. So those 3 things. Let me go back. I just realized that I was nervous that I forgot to talk about the second half of 2022, what to watch. One thing that it will be interesting if something happens, and I'm hopeful that something positive will happen, is Japan and China is going to be commemorating its 50th anniversary since the 1972 normalization. And I wonder if anything's going to be happening in September. And that is to be seen. And I think obviously China is going to be very much an agenda for Japanese politics, including what to do with the fact that we have so many people knocking on the door of CPTPP, including UK, Taiwan, and China, and what Japan's going to do about the fact that we have both Taiwan and China wanting to join the CPTPP. And finally, since I was asked about Taiwan, yes, there has been some language from Mr. Russel as well as former Prime Minister Abe about how he said basically that any contingency for Taiwan is a contingency for Japan. And although that might seem very obvious, but at the same time, very much a dramatic change, I think the basic policy in Japan has not changed. And I think more importantly, that the language that's been coming out of the United States and Japan has been on the same page since the Suga Biden summit in April. Suga was the first foreign leader to visit the White House after Biden took place, but it's always been to underscore the importance of peace and stability in the Taiwan Straits, and that has been the consistent theme, and the two countries are on the same page. Having said that, there are some points that I'm concerned about the Taiwan issue going forward. Let me just raise three. One is the prior consultation process. Is that going to go as it's supposed to go between the United States and Japan? Is it obvious that U.S. will be able to use the basis from Japan? Two is what will the Self-Defense Force do in a Taiwan contingency? There's some simulations going on among the defense experts about what exactly they'll be doing, but that will be an issue and something to look for. And that three is about the issue of base resiliency. China, there's the buildup of Chinese missiles has gone to a point where most of the bases in Japan are very vulnerable to any missile attack. So we are considering, or we should be considering, how to make our bases, both the United States and Japan, to be more resilient. So those are the 3 points about the Taiwan situation that I'd like to add. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much. Really appreciated that. It strikes me, given the composition of our group here this morning, this afternoon, this evening, depending on what part of the world you happen to be in at the moment, is that we should, frankly, try and reflect on 2022 in terms of the future of the Quad. Takako just mentioned before the possibility of a Quad summit in Tokyo in the flesh in May. But let's flip back to you for a minute or so, Danny. How do you think, from Washington's point of view, the Quad could or should evolve during the course of the year ahead? And then to Raja, and then back to you, Takako, and I might even throw in an Australian perspective. But there you go. Back to you, Danny.
Thanks, Kevin. And definitely we would love to hear your perspective from Australia. Look, I'd stick with the principle of delivery. The Quad 2.0, rebooted under the Biden administration, I think is very much a new and improved arrangement. The reason for that is that the Quad that the previous U.S. administration tried to employ, that Mike Pompeo used as sort of a blunt instrument against China, was very bombastic, very kind of militaristic, and I don't think it would have held together under pressure, given where India is and given where Japan is. The rebooted Quad 2.0 seemed to be reconstituted on the principle of the things that these four democracies, these four industrialized countries, could do together in the interests of the broader Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific region. That's the smart way to compete with China, not by headbutting, but by, in effect, outperforming, if not outwitting. So I think the concept was very good, and the emphasis on a vaccine initiative was extremely well received. Now, admittedly, there were understandable manufacturing hangups in India, given the severity of the pandemic there for a while. But the delivery schedule has actually been restored. They're producing millions of vaccines and distributing them each month. I think they're on track to meet the goal of 1 billion doses delivered. They've also initiated a number of very important working groups in the areas that the countries in the region genuinely care about. Things like public health more broadly beyond vaccines, and things like emerging technologies. That's what the developing world needs and wants. Now, the challenge in 2022 is not holding a foreign ministerial or not even holding a summit, although that's a very powerful action-forcing event, but rather in fulfilling some of these processes and translating working groups and meetings and processes into tangible results. If the Quad, for example, in the course of 2022, is able to start implementing programs for sharing and for upskilling in important emerging technologies to enhance innovation, entrepreneurship, and competitiveness among the medium-sized and the smaller countries in both South Asia and Southeast Asia, they will begin to gain tremendously valuable traction in the geopolitical and geoeconomic competition between the West and China.
Fascinating, my friend, in terms of where this one's going to go. Raja, India, looking ahead for 2022 on the Quad. Be fascinating to hear your reflections there. And given where you've just been recently in Singapore, what do you think behind the scenes our friends in Southeast Asia actually think about the Quad, notwithstanding what they may say publicly about it? Over to you.
Yeah, I would say, for India, the new format 2.0, as Danny called it, where you separate the military function and use this for a much broader non-military strategic areas. India is very, very comfortable with this format. It's not that India does not do security cooperation. It's being done bilaterally, maybe even trilaterally, but the Quad, framing it as a non-military strategic organization, actually works very well for India. And the creation of AUKUS actually nicely separates the Quad from the purely military alliance that has been created. So I think this is really a good arrangement. Second, I would say the vaccine production. I think India is now in good way to produce a lot of the original commitments, thanks to the initial help from the United States. So I think some of the ambitious programs that were identified can now be implemented. The new areas that have been talked about, including on 5G, on a whole range of areas, including space. They've included space now. This is not something that's been widely debated, but I think as Russia and China come together to quicken the pace of exploration of the moon and exploitation of resources, the Artemis Accords, the Quad cooperation will acquire, I think, a new momentum in terms of reshaping the rules of commerce on the space side, outer space and moon. So this will be an exciting one as well. Coming to your main point, I think one of the tasks for Quad is really to be able to reach out to the Southeast Asians and talk to them bilaterally, trilaterally, whichever form, to reduce some of the misperceptions. Because the publicly articulated formulation that the Quad will replace ASEAN, I think we are past that phase. And they also see that, look, Quad is going to be around. At least the realists in the region say, look, Quad is there. It's not going to disappear. And in fact, Quad is there because ASEAN can't do what it thinks it can do or what it says it will do. Because Chinese power has put great stress on ASEAN's coherence and its ability to really take up the issues. That doesn't mean ASEAN's relevance is over. But I think for them, having a strong Quad I think will increase each one of their leverage vis-a-vis China to be able to negotiate better terms with China. At least the realists see that. But the format-wise, the old remnants of residual non-alignments, that kind of an argument will keep framing the public discourse. But I think each one of them will benefit by having a strong Quad that works not in a confrontational manner with China, but can offer alternatives from infrastructure to technology and a range of other areas. And if we can get the Europeans in with their global gateway, unlike Americans, Europeans bring more money. And if that can be a valuable tool here to actually offer alternatives on the infrastructure, Belt and Road side. Criticizing is not enough. Japan had put up some money in the Partnership for Quality Infrastructure. Now the Europeans come, you can really construct a coalition that can deliver some results.
Again, fascinating. Takako, Kishida-san, you mentioned before, is slightly less hawkish on China than Abe-san. In terms of the future of the Quad, do you see that having an impact in terms of Japanese deep strategic views of the Quad's utility? How would Tokyo like to see the Quad look by year's end?
Thank you. I mentioned that inherently, Kishida-san comes from a faction within the LDP that's less hawkish, but whether or not he will be less hawkish in the delivery of policy is yet to be seen, because he might be pressured by the hawkish wing of the LDP to appear more hawkish, which was a problem that Mr. Abe didn't have, because he himself was relatively hawkish, that he didn't have to cater to the demands of the hawks. It's kind of ironic that there might be some of the actual policy, I'm not too sure, would be less hawkish. Like, it depends on what you mean by hawkish, but less aggressive or less strong language on China. Having said that, I think for the Quad, it will be interesting to see how that goes together with the emphasis in what Mr. Kishida has called the realist diplomacy for the new era, if there is going to be a continuing emphasis on the commonality between the four countries, which is the democratic norms. And I think there is some worry within Japan about the approach the U.S. has taken in terms of for the Summit for Democracy, that if we emphasize too much about the normative aspects of the commonality between the four countries within the Quad, that might alienate some countries in the region. And it is interesting that the top priority, or top what first mentioned by Mr. Kishida as the three determination of the Kishida diplomacy is to protect universal values. But there is a worry that too much emphasis on that to be the driving force of the Quad, although it is actually the case that might make things a little more difficult. So I think Japan is very happy for the Quad to be the pragmatic approach, take the pragmatic approach that Dr. Mohan just said, in terms of looking at vaccine diplomacy and other deliverables that Japan can offer to the countries in the region, and not as much emphasis on the norms or the democracy aspect as to be as an extension of what the U.S. is trying to do in other aspects. So that's my take. And I do think that China is probably wrong to say that Quad might disappear like a sea foam. And that I do hope that Japan will take the opportunity to host the Quad, not as an exciting opportunity to have not just the exciting opportunity to have President Biden come, but that's going to be in the news the most, but actually something concrete that Japan could look forward to contributing to the Quad itself. So thank you.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you in the analysis that the initial Chinese assessment that it would simply bob up as something fashionable, that is the Quad, and then dissipate with a subsequent news cycle. I don't think the evidence points in that direction at all. There's too much, as I observe it, a fundamental strategic shift in Tokyo, particularly in Delhi, and of a more long-standing nature in Australia in terms of Quad 2.0, as Danny aptly described it. The only addition I would add from the Antipodean perspective, from our part of the world, is we face Australian national elections in the next several months. They will have to be held by May. the attitude of the alternative government of Australia, which would be led by the Australian Labor Party, is fully embracing of the Quad. That's significant. The Labor Party is a centre-left party. And for the last 6 months, they've been comfortably ahead in the opinion polls and now more decisively so in the downward stretch towards the election. Still, anything can happen in politics. But on this core question, the leadership team of the alternative government of Australia are strongly behind not just the Quad as it stands, but its further enhancement as well. Danny, I've got a question in from the public asking this one. So if you could give me a quick 60-second on it. DPRK, South Korea. Well, the question is, and this is from Brian on YouTube, is what the DPRK currently doing by way of its rapid-fire set of tests going to promote a very large-scale arms race on the part of the South and its reaction, or the acquisition of parallel weapon systems, obviously not nukes, but other more, shall I say, responsive platforms? Over to you on arms race on the peninsula.
Yeah, great question. It varies a little bit based, I think, on the question of who wins the upcoming presidential election in the Republic of Korea. Clearly, Yoon, the conservative candidate, is more likely to put his emphasis on South Korea's defense capabilities and take a more strategic or military-based approach, whereas Lee, the progressive candidate, is likely to follow in the footsteps of President Moon Jae-in as a progressive, concentrate more on the inducement side of the equation, on diplomacy, et cetera. So there'll be some differences there. But that said, I think the short answer is yes, because the tests that North Korea is conducting brings home the vulnerability not only of U.S. bases on the Korean peninsula and, of course, U.S. bases in Japan and even in Guam, but of South Korea's own defense infrastructure. These are not intercontinental ballistic missiles. These are rockets, and they are short and intermediate range missiles that could wreak havoc on South Korean military installations. So I think that for the Republic of Korea, as well as for Japan, there's going to be, as a result of North Korean recent behavior, an intensified focus both on hardening, shielding, dispersing to survive an attack, but also, as Takako mentioned, capabilities that allow for a preemptive strike against North Korean offensive weapons, principally as a deterrent.
Little footnote to that is, given that, where does it take current centre of gravity in South Korean politics on the future, shall we say, further deployment of THAAD-type systems, given the Chinese reaction in the past and what President Moon has so far indicated would be, as I best understand it, somewhat of a moratorium on future THAAD-type deployments in the South? Danny, your reflections on that?
Right. Well, that's a great question. And I'm having PTSD, having lived through the aftermath of the THAAD deployment when I was in government. Look, that too depends greatly on whether a conservative or progressive controls the Blue House. I think THAAD itself is almost radioactive in South Korea, given the tremendous price that the Lotte Group was forced to pay financially and commercially as a result of China's punitive measures. Notwithstanding the fact that the Moon government claims that it didn't make a compromise, Moon's 3 no's effectively yielded to Chinese bullying by acknowledging that South Korea, for all intents and purposes, would not deploy further THAAD systems. Now, remember, THAAD systems don't belong to South Korea. These are U.S. systems that were deployed by the U.S. military to protect U.S. military facilities. They also have a retail price of well over $1 billion. So the issue of putting more THAAD arsenals and our systems in South Korea is maybe a little bit theoretical. But without a doubt, even in a progressive Korean administration, I predict that we are going to be seeing greater investment in the sort of defensive capabilities that will shield South Korean military facilities from the growing North Korean offensive weapons.
Yeah, a question now from Bart. We've got 5 minutes left, so quick answer from you, if it's okay, Roger, Bart comes from the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. What countries should we be watching for internal conflict eruptions in the coming year? Of the obvious list being Afghanistan, Myanmar, and Kazakhstan at this stage. Question mark Kazakhstan, but any reflections on the internal conflict question? Over to you, Roger.
Myanmar, quite clearly, I mean, I think there's talk about a civil war, so that seems to be quite a danger, given the very little room for internal compromises and the inability of the ASEAN really to hold on to a tough line. So I think we're in a really a difficult situation out there. And given the long history of the ethnic conflict in the north and the coupled with the democracy struggle that goes on. And I would agree with Afghanistan again, which is really, Taliban has not settled down. I mean, I think the problem is if they try to be reasonable to please the rest of the world, much of their cadres are going to revolt or threaten to join ISIS and other organizations. So they have really, for all the triumphant thing against the Americans, they have a serious problem constructing a stable regime. And then some of this, I'm sure, will also get carried over into Pakistan. So I think that if you think of AFPAC together, the series of conflicts there, I think will also be serious. But Kazakhstan, I doubt, because the Russian capacity to control and the old order has been restored. So I don't see Kazakhstan getting into a civil war situation. I would put Myanmar and Afghanistan as the likely candidates.
Good. Last question, given we're almost at the top of the hour, and I might try and field this one myself, Takako, but please add if you wish. It's about climate change and climate change policies and the prospects for convergence around net zero across Asia. A thought or two about this from me. China's commitment in terms of 2060 for it to achieve net zero. There's a huge debate within the Chinese system now about power shortages, and I'm advised that the pressure being mounted by the coal and broader hydrocarbon lobby on the government in Beijing is enormous. So far, the centre is holding on this, but given that 2022 is such a critical year politically in China, my prediction will be we're going to see some shall I say, less rigorous performance by China in calendar year 2022 in terms of the speed of the transformation to renewable energy. But at the same time, my understanding is that the Chinese have already locked in to their planning mechanisms a trajectory towards 2060. India, Raja could have answered this question himself, but given Prime Minister Modi's undertaking in Glasgow about 2070, my understanding is that the policy machinery is starting to grind into action in Delhi as well, and that we will start to see more actions by India in terms of the realisation of its own greenhouse gas reduction targets. As for the rest of Asia, I think there are challenges for Japan, which has been an early strong performer in carbon reductions, but now in the post-Kyoto period, a fresh emphasis on what Japan, as the third largest economy in the world, needs to do, and also given hydrocarbon significance within the country. The rest of Asia, of course, includes my own country, Australia, which has been an appalling performer in the last 7 or 8 years in terms of carbon reductions. If there is a change of government in Australia, that will change by way of national policy. The ROK, I'm not familiar with where policy settings stand at present. I think one of the big agenda items for Pan-Asia, however, will be, can we begin to bring about an interlinking of the carbon markets of the major economies of Asia over the course of the decade ahead, and with a credible carbon price? That would be a significant contributor to bringing down greenhouse gas emissions. So that's a response to Bart's question. I'm very mindful of the time. We try to start on time and finish on time at the Asia Society. And so can I thank our guests, Takako Hikotani, who joins us from the Asia Society Policy Institute in Tokyo, who is a fellow at our Asia Society Centre there. Roger Mohan, distinguished contributor to the foreign policy debate, not just within his own country, India, but right across Asia, and much respected for his views. And our very own Danny Russell in New York for his valuable insights, given his great career service too, with China, Japan, Northeast Asia and beyond. My name's Kevin Rudd. I join you from the Asia Society, of which I'm proud to be the President and Global CEO. We'll be back with you again with forthcoming events with the Asia Society Policy Institute during the month of February. Thank you for joining us.